So in chapter 20, we are focused on something known as phylogeny, and this is really how scientists try to make sense and model evolutionary relationships between different organisms. For example, we have in existence legless lizards and legless snakes. Obviously, snakes don't have legs, but there's also legless lizards, and we have found that these creatures have evolved from different lizards with legs. So in studying their relationships to each other and to other organisms, it was found that lizards without legs have evolved independently in several different groups through their adaptation to similar environments. And we model this through something known as a phylogenetic tree, which is shown here. And as you can see, this kind of shows us the relationships between all these different organisms. And today I'm going to teach you how to read them and how to interpret them as well. So phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or a group of related species, and there's a process known as systematics that we consider this discipline that we use to classify organisms and determine how they're related via evolution. So in 20.1, we get used to seeing a lot of terminology, and we know from evolution and our study of descent with modification that when organisms share characteristics, it indicates they probably have a common ancestor. So through the process of taxonomy, we are able to order and name different organisms, and we do a lot of this based on their relationships with each other. You probably read about in chapter 19, Carolus Linnaeus. He created a system of taxonomy that is based on resemblance. We don't use a ton of his taxonomy today in terms of how the organisms are related. We use phylogeny more for that, but we still maintain his two-part names and also work with a hierarchy. So we talked about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That's the hierarchy, and then for most species, we use their genus and their species as their name. So for example, humans are Homo sapiens. And then we talked about in genetics, the flies, Drosophila melanogaster. So that's some examples. Like I mentioned, the scientific name is two parts. So we have the genus and the species. And this gives you a little bit more about how organisms are named. And then also we know that these organisms are based into categories. So like I said, we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And then we have the three domains, bacteria, archaea, and animalia. And the eukarya, essentially. These are our eukaryotes, these are our prokaryotes, and these are some ancestral organisms that typically they live in hot springs, things like that. Then within any level of hierarchy, one group is called a taxon, and we can see that these taxons are related very closely to each other, but not necessarily between other lineages. So how systematists show evolutionary relationships is through a process known as making phylogenetic trees or phylogenetic trees. So these trees show the relationships between a group of organisms using a branching diagram. So you can see here we've got our phylogenetic tree, and we have quite a few different canines and carnivores here. We have an otter, a badger, and a leopard. And wherever you see a branch point, where those come together represents a common ancestor. So in this case, for example, the coyote and the gray wolf share a common ancestor, and then the coyote and the gray wolf also share a common ancestor with the otter and the badger a little bit further back. And then if we were to ask where is the common ancestor of all carnivores, it would be all the way up here, because you can see over here we branch off into the felines, we get some badgers and otters from over here, and then finally the canines. So the common ancestor for all of the carnivores are here. Then we so that's our branch point. Sister taxa are groups that share an immediate common ancestor, so they're each other's closest relatives. In this case, according to this tree, the coyote and the gray wolf would be sister taxa. And then this is our branch point representing their common ancestor. A rootage tree includes a branch to represent the most recent common ancestor of all the taxa in the tree. And the basal taxon is one that it leaves early on in the group and originates near the common ancestor. So over here we can see that early on in the evolutionary history, we separated the felines and the Mustelidae and the Canidae, so that was an early relationship. And then a polytomy is a branch from which more than two groups emerge. So this means that we don't necessarily know the evolutionary relationship between those two groups yet, but we infer that they are distinctly different. So here's an example of a basic phylogenetic tree. This would be the most recent common ancestor of taxa A through G. So you can see it's where all the points connect. The branch point is where you see lineages diverge. Then we have our sister taxa B and C. And then you can see taxon G, and to some extent our D, E, F diverged pretty early on. But especially G is one of the first to separate. So that's our group that has diverged early on in the history. Over here we have a polymetomy, which is the unresolved pattern of divergence. So we don't necessarily know how these three became different, D, E, and F, but we know that they are different. Some key points about phylogenetic trees. Number one is that they show patterns of descent, not phenotypic similarity. So just because two organisms are listed as being closely related on a phylogenetic tree doesn't necessarily mean they're going to look together. So this is not necessarily based on just the physical phenotype look. Second, they don't really give us a good idea of when a species evolved or how much change occurred in a particular time. It doesn't tell us the ages of species. It's just meant to show us the order in which things happened. And also, it should not be assumed that a taxon on a phylogenetic tree evolved from the taxon next to it. So you can't necessarily claim that A and B, so that you can't just say B and C evolved from each other. You just know that they had a common ancestor here, that branch point, but you don't really know what that is. The reason why we care about phylogenies is because they provide information for us about how species are similarly grouped and how that similarity might reflect that they are closely related. And we can also use DNA sequences to infer the identities of particular species. So we, in the textbook, see an example where they use DNA sequence to identify the species of a particular whale when they didn't know which whale this whale meat came from. So they had this unknown DNA of these different whales, and then they compared them to the phylogenetic tree of the whales that existed, and were able to figure out what were the most similar DNA sequences to already existing whales, and that's how they were able to figure out what type of whale it was. So we'll go ahead and stop there for this video.